But Dr. Richard Kahn is as he gleefully pointed out to me tonight, he is a true Union physician, because although his post office address is Warren, he actually lives in Union. He is a medical historian as a sidelight to his practice of medicine in the Rockland area, and with that, I'll turn it over to him.
Let me get this all set up here. First of all, my arm didn't have to be twisted to come here. I mean, I enjoy, as you do, I enjoy doing this. I'm very interested in history of medicine and have been so for a long time. My interest in history, as I was saying to Randall earlier, I mean, I think physicians and other people too get guilt if they're not doing what they're supposed to do, even though guilt is squalid, according to my wife. You know, I should be reading medicine all the time. You know, I mean, reading a whodunit, you know, I'm wasting time, I should be doing something. So medical history, or, you know, history in general, it sort of gets you a little bit away from medicine, but you're learning about medicine, and it's, you know, it's history and how many of the things that are happening today are very similar to what happened 100 years ago, 50 years ago, with variations. Let me just turn this around. Okay, I'm going to first talk about transportation of the wounded during the Civil War, and that will be my main talk. But I've also prepared a little bit about disease and surgery during the Civil War. That will be right at the end. In 500 B.C., Hippocrates said, quote, "He who would be a surgeon should join an army and follow it," end quote. There's a lot to be learned during wartime, particularly in surgery. War has also been said to be an epidemic of trauma. Well, it's also an epidemic of epidemics. And this first slide of this man, Private A. Parker, D Company, Maine 1st Cavalry, was considered fit for battle while carrying a diagnosis of chronic diarrhea and dysentery. He was captured shortly after this picture was taken and died in Andersonville Prison July 21st, 1864. And I'll talk a little bit later about, disease. I mean, it was actually disease killed twice as many people as the wounds of battle. But this man, can you just see him carrying on in war? But that's what was happening. I mean, it seems like everything you read, just about everybody had dysentery of some sort or another. Today, I'll briefly outline the early efforts, primarily in Europe, of transporting the wounded in wartime, and then I'll discuss the U.S. Medical Corps at the outset of the Civil War, Jonathan Letterman and his contribution to the development of the Medical Corps, and the efficient transportation of the wounded, and finally show some illustrations of types of litters and ambulances used in the Civil War. This is the Andersonville prison. I meant to show that before. So here he is, ready to go to battle, and there's where he ended up, Andersonville prison, which did not help his health. In 1487, Queen Isabella of Spain introduced bedded wagons to carry casualties to large hospital tents, which were located well in the rear of battle. Very little thought went into the plight of the wounded until the work of Dominique Jean Laurie, who was to become surgeon-in-chief to Napoleon's army. In 1792, he introduced the ambulance volante, for flying field hospitals, which were capable of moving quickly from place to place like the flying artillery of his time. Ambulance wagons were part of these flying field hospitals. The term ambulance, derived from the Latin ambulare, meaning to move or march, among the continental military people, the term means a hospital establishment moving with the armies in the field. In England and America, the word applies to ambulance wagons or other conveyances by which the wounded were transported to field and fixed hospitals. Laurie's flying ambulance was a carriage, well sprung capable of being drawn by 2 or 4 horses. The two-wheeled version had double doors at each end to facilitate movement of the stretchers. It was roomy enough to dress wounds inside on the floor if the weather were bad. Four-wheeler was larger and wider with a mattress fixed to the floor. It could accommodate 4 reclining patients and was drawn by 4 horses, 2 of which were ridden by orderlies. And these are actually from his book. And afterwards, I put a little exhibit up here of some instruments of the period, and Laurie's book is here as well as another Civil War book. Baron Percy, also a physician to Napoleon's army, designed this 4-wheeled ambulance called Percy's Wurst sausage. It was a strange sight to see this long wagon with 8 surgeons astride it, one behind the other, moving onto the field of battle. It never really caught on. Britain and America were slow to develop an effective system for transporting the sick and wounded soldiers. The British Army did not adopt means of transporting the wounded until the Crimean War in 1854. The Civil War. April 14th, 1861, the day Fort Sumter fell, the United States regular army consisted of 15,000 officers and men. The 80-year-old Surgeon General Lawson had 3 clerks, 30 surgeons, 83 assistant surgeons. 24 of those surgeons resigned to join the Confederacy. President Lincoln called for 75,000 militia the next day. The states sent surgeons with their militia. However, medical equipment and ambulances were variable and generally deficient in quality and quantity. The Union Army was divided into regular and volunteer army, as you well know, better than I do. As of 1865, there were only 21,669 in the regular army and approximately 2 million in the volunteer regimental units. 1861-62 were years of frustration for the medical corps. Shortages of ambulances, poorly trained stretcher bearers, and undisciplined drivers were the rule. At the First Battle of Bull Run, July 21st, 1861, the 1st Connecticut Volunteers had 600 to 700 men and 1 4-wheeled ambulance, no hand litters, and few hospital supplies. Friends and relatives often took the wounded back to farmhouses or to Washington, 25 miles away. 4 or more days were required for medical help to reach the 3,000 wounded. Towards the end of the Peninsula Campaign, an Army Corps of 30,000 men had ambulance transportation for 100. And I just, in reading about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and worked on a program for the medical history of Portland, Longfellow traveled down to take his ill son and bring him back, and so did a lot of the other people I've read about. Another problem was that ambulances were not controlled by medical personnel. Rather, they were controlled by the commanding officer and quartermaster corps. Surgeon Tripler reported to General McClellan, quote, "I found them," that is the ambulances, "in general use as pleasure carriages for idlers and accommodation cabs for conveying officers and men from their camps to the city of Washington. A large number of them had already broken down in this service," end quote. The problem of poorly trained stretcher bearers was equally severe. At the Battle of Bull Run, the stretcher bearers were selected from regimental musicians and convalescents. Scrubbing bloody floors and disposing of dirty, scabby, pussy bandages and carrying bloody, shocky soldiers had nothing to do with music. Many fled the scene. Quote, "Most were averse to labor and habitually insubordinate," end quote, stated one regimental commander. Can you imagine at this time, they're about to do an amputation, and at these busy field hospitals, just seeing, all these, you'll see in a couple minutes, piles of legs, arms, pus, smell, a hot day. It must have been absolutely hideous. And I think it's difficult for people who are used to it. We're dealing in, say, medical field and that sort of, but for people who would just say, okay, you be a stretcher bearer, you do this, it would have been absolutely hard to comprehend, but they did it. The ambulance drivers were predominantly civilians hired by the Quartermaster Corps. At the Battle of Bull Run, Surgeon General Hammond commandeered vehicles from the streets of Washington, rounding up 140 hacks, 40 buses, and a number of beer trucks and delivery vans. Many of the drivers were civilian drunks and thieves who ran when they heard gunfire. On October 9th, 1862, the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, now the New England Journal of Medicine, Dr. Henry Bowditch of Harvard wrote, quote, malicious pleasure quote, malicious pleasure the drunken drivers took in doing all the damage they could to the valuable vehicles entrusted to them by most unnecessary collisions, end quote. He described tilting, in which one driver would try to drive the pole of his ambulance into the water cask of the ambulance in front of him. So it's like jousting with their ambulances. This disgraceful state of affairs caused Surgeon General Hammond in June of 1862 to appoint Major Jonathan Letterman as medical director of the Army of the Potomac to replace Tripler. On July 1st, 1862, Letterman replaced Tipler, and on July 2nd, Letterman's plan was put into effect by General Order Number 147. This plan provided for an officer to command the ambulance corps under the control of the medical director. Continual drills and inspections were to be conducted by officers of the medical corps. Only interested men of good moral character were to be accepted as ambulance drivers and stretcher bearers. Special insignia on the uniforms of these men would be provided. And that's a hospital corpsman. And this is a knapsack used by the medical corpsman. Only medical corpsmen were to remove the wounded from the field of battle. The results of this plan were seen in the Battle of Antietam, September 16, 1862, the bloodiest event of the Civil War. 200 ambulances had joined the Army at Frederick, and 10,000 wounded soldiers were supposedly collected and placed in shelter within 24 hours after the battle. Of interest is this close resemblance of Letterman's proposal to Laurie's flying ambulance used in Napoleon's battles. These are a lot of group of ambulances. The two ambulances used in the Civil War corresponded to the two types used by Laurie, the murderous two-wheel and the merciful four-wheel. And I guess their descriptions of traveling in these ambulances, particularly the two-wheel ambulance, they'd rather be dead. In addition to the ambulances, men were transported in wagons, hospital trains such as this one, and in boats. A word about Jonathan Letterman. He was born in Cannonburg, Pennsylvania in 1824. He graduated from Jefferson Medical College in 1845. After a 3-year preceptorship with his father, he attended Jefferson Medical College 1848 and 49. He was commissioned in the Army in 1849. His career took him to Virginia, Florida, Minnesota, Kansas, New Mexico, and California before the Civil War. It is interesting to note that from 1819 to 1870, the medical department collected the only national weather data in keeping with the current theories of disease relating to miasmata and climactic conditions. In other words, at this time they really didn't know what caused disease, and they felt that the weather was the cause of much of it, and if they could keep track of the weather, they may be able to prevent diseases. Maybe there was something to that. April 1861, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a group of influential physicians and private citizens, was founded and began to agitate for reform in the medical department. Apparently they had some influence on Hammond's choice of Letterman as medical director of the Army of the Potomac. The Sanitary Commission did much good work throughout the war, much as the Red Cross was to do later. Certainly the remainder of the war had its high and low points, both militarily as well as medically. At Fredericksburg on December 13, 1862, Burnside attacked and entrenched Lee. It was a military disaster, but a medical success. There were 18 field hospitals in place, forward dressing stations, and an ambulance corps which evacuated the wounded day and night. 110,000 Union troops fought that day, with 1,300 killed, 1,000 missing, and over 9,000 wounded. At Gettysburg, however, July of 1863, 22,000 Union and Confederate wounded lay in fields and ditches, woods and barns, haystacks and homes and churches for as long as 5 days in the sun and rain, waiting for help. A young woman described a, quote, sickening, overpowering, awful stench of unburied dead men and horses, end quote. In one woodland there was a long row of unconscious men shot through the head. They were considered hopeless and they lay, quote, twitching and groaning, oblivious to the onlookers, end quote, which they would soon die. The surgery of the head, chest, and abdomen was rarely attempted. Amputations, however, were a major surgical procedure of the war, and this is a photograph of an amputation. And this photograph, I'm sure you've seen before, a pile of amputated limbs represented one morning's work of one of the surgical teams. And I thought I'd talk about amputations a little bit later, but they were doing the best they can. The statistics, I'll show you statistics later about amputations done early and late, and it was just a standard treatment. There were no treatment of infection. There's nothing available. They really didn't understand it. We'll go over that a little bit later. Congress passed an act to establish a uniform system of ambulances in the armies of the United States. This was approved by President Lincoln March 11, 1864, and promulgated by Order 106. Letterman's plan for the Army of the Potomac had become the Army Ambulance Corps. Now I'd like to just talk a little bit about the equipment. Litters and stretchers were borne by men were available in several models at the time of the Civil War. Over 52,000 were purchased and issued to Union troops between 1861 and 65. The Satterlee was made of ash and canvas, had wrought iron legs, and weighed 24 pounds. The Halstead had legs of oak, which proved too fragile for the rough use and abuse in wartime. The shell, I just want to make sure, yep, could be used as a bed as well as a stretcher, but its legs were easily broken. The two-wheeled ambulance was nicknamed the Avalanche because it so violently ejected its occupants to the ground while underway. And just imagine traveling across a field, stones, having a gunshot, a broken femur, some broken arm, broken back, whatever, and these ambulances, two-wheeled wagons, over rocks, back and forth, being thrown up and down. It's just hard to believe what it might be like. In October 1859, a board of medical officers consisting of surgeons Finley, Coolidge, Tripler, Satterlee, and Crowler reviewed two- and four-wheeled ambulances and felt that the two-wheeled were best. The board hesitated to choose the Finley model over the Coolidge model because both men served on the board. Sounds familiar. Both models were recommended. Most regiments had one or a few Finleys. They were too light and easily broken and were unsuited to the rough roads and fields of war. 200 of the Coolidge models were ordered at $150 apiece. These too were flimsy and shook to pieces. Most were unfit for use after 50 miles. In April 1862, Tripler wrote of the two-wheelers, quote, "Their motion is unbearable and excruciating. Men beg to be taken out of them, and the wounded officers insist on leaving them," end quote. Tripler closed his letters with, quote, "Hope no more be built," end quote. None were built after 1862. They were replaced by the four-wheeled models, one of which was designed by Tripler himself. These are several more ambulances and a litter, a little bed there. The Tripler, this is the Tripler, could carry 10 men, 4 recumbent and 6 sitting, required 4 horses. It was used throughout the war but construction of new ones ceased in 1862. It weighed 700 to 800 pounds and cost between $147 and $275 each. The Rucker model, designed by Major General Rucker of the Quartermaster's Corps, could accommodate 4 recumbent. That's a Rucker. That just shows what can be done inside. It could accommodate 4 recumbent and 8 to 10 ambulatory patients. The Rucker ambulance trains were a common sight during the Civil War. The Wheeling, or Rosencrantz, were lighter and more maneuverable than the other 4-wheeled model. It was designed by General W.S. Rosecrans and was first built in the government shops in Wheeling, West Virginia. The ambulances had to be stored and repaired, as the following slides will show. This is the chief of the ambulance, 1st Division, 9th Corps in Petersburg in 1864. So this is showing the organization of the ambulance corps. This is an ambulance train just stored, all ready to go near Harwood Hospital. And this is another ambulance corral showing the Wheeling and Rucker ambulances. And this is the repair shop in Washington, D.C. In addition to actual ambulances, Army wagons were fitted to serve the purpose. There were also specialized medical wagons which operated as a field pharmacy at General Thomas's headquarters. And this is a field pharmacy. This is a wagon set out to be a local pharmacy. The medications that they had were not very efficacious, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, and I have a handout sheet of the medicines that were available, as well as some other statistics. Trains and ships were also used to transport the wounded whenever practical, primarily to move patients to larger hospitals after they had received preliminary treatment and field hospitals. For example, Letterman was responsible for moving 9,025 sick and wounded men from Fredericksburg to Washington, June of 1863. The convoy began in the morning of June 12th, and by 6 p.m. June 14th, all had left the depot at Acquia for Washington. The men were taken from the battlefield to waiting ambulances, then to the railroad station at Fredericksburg. From there they went by train to Acquia Creek and then hospital ship to Washington. Use of the telegraph wires by the Signal Corps allowed coordination of the movement of this large number of men without, quote, without difficulty or accident, end quote, according to Letterman. I doubt that it was without difficulty, but anyway, that's what they said. The Civil War marked the beginning of modern ambulance design, and subsequent wars called for endless refinements to the solution of the basic problem, transporting the wounded. The following slides just show a few more recent ambulances, and some of you may, I doubt, recognize this one. This is the Kummer ambulance. This is 1916 to 18, Great Britain. This is U.S. Navy Marine Corps Field Ambulance, stowed at sea aboard the hospital ship Relief in 1921. And then airplanes were also used in 1918. And this is just a World War II ambulance manufactured by Dodge, but I'm not going to go into the rest of that. So that's what and we can talk about this when we turn the lights on. I can't see any of you, and I hope you're, I don't mind if you look at your watch, but when you hold it up to your ear and shake it, that's annoying. Anyway, with the lights on, it's a little bit, I think we can probably see the rest of the slides with the lights in the back on. But I just want to talk a little bit about Civil War deaths and some of the treatments. I have, if you want to pass out those, I don't know if you can. Somebody else wants one, but I just put these on from different places and stuck them on one sheet. What this shows, enlistments at the top, Union and then Confederate estimate, but deaths, and it shows, in battle, 110,070 died. And of disease, 224,586. Accidents, um, 24,872. So many, many more people died of disease than of battle injuries, and a similar number in the Confederacy. These are some of the wounds and illnesses. At the top, of 246,000 cases of wounds, 245,790 were shot wounds, and 922 were saber and bayonet wounds. And then the rest of these are all sicknesses and illnesses, and with deaths. Unbelievable. If you look at these two numbers, diarrhea, and we saw Private Parker at the beginning of my talk, acute dysentery, typhoid. Those are the main ones. Chronic dysentery. They have a number of names. I mean, well, there are a number of illnesses that they hadn't yet separated. And I just think to put it in perspective, if we're talking about the early 1860s, it's not until Lister and antisepsis in the 1870s. It wasn't even in the 1870s, 1880s. The etiology, the cause of disease, wasn't really proven until certainly the 1870s, and really the first proof was Koch in 1882, proving that tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria. So they didn't really understand. You know, they thought, for example, malaria, which was a common disease in the South. The word comes from the Italian malaria, mal bad, air, and they thought that the illnesses would come in on the marsh breezes. Well, we know now it's the mosquitoes that carried malaria, but they didn't know then. Let me just see. So, typhomalarial fever, typhoid, typhus, all these things were big killers, and their latrines were near streams that they took the drinking water out. The conditions were absolutely horrible. Part of it because, of course, the situation is war, but another part was they really didn't understand at the time the relationship and that they were causing a lot. I'm sure they could have prevented many, even without antibiotics, and just to give you some feeling for that, typhoid fever, generally antibiotics aren't very helpful. It's usually a self-limited illness. You only use antibiotics somebody who's absolutely deathly sick, and it may help. It prolongs the carrier state. So it's not antibiotics that have made the difference, it's sanitation that have made the big difference, and hydration that was not available to them during the Civil War. Some of the treatments, and I've just on that sheet of paper, these are a list of medications that were used. There were very few efficacious drugs in the 1860s. In the 1840s, Oliver Wendell Holmes said, he was a professor at Harvard. He said, if you threw the whole materia medica, in other words, all the medicines available, into the sea, save opium, wine, if I remember correctly, opium, wine, digitalis, and quinine, it would be all the better for mankind and all the worse for the fishes. And that really didn't change. There were very few that really worked. In that whole list, there's only a couple. Opium could be used, pain medication, as well as decrease the number of bowel movements in diarrhea, but very few others. Digitalis, which wasn't a big problem for young, healthy people. I mean, people having heart failure during the Civil War. They're predominantly younger people, and so that was a useful medicine, but really didn't have much to do with the Civil War. But very few were. Most people got a little alcohol. It made them feel better while they were dying. So the treatments weren't good. Medical illnesses. What about surgery? Amputation, as I mentioned, amputation was standard treatment. If you were shot or you fell and broke your leg and had a compound fracture, a bone sticking out, it would become infected and you'd lose the limb, and chances are you'd lose your life. And there are statistics to show that the mortality would increase from something like 28%. I mean, these statistics you can shoot some holes in, but would increase from 28 to 56% if you operated more than a day after the initial injury, after the skin was broken, and after the injury. The other point that's made on this slide, I'm sorry, my little homemade slide making business, but anyway, the mortality from amputation also depended a great deal on where the amputation, where it took place. I mean, in what part of the body. You know, your femur had to be taken off at the hip. This is just showing a surgical case, and I just point out several things. One, that the instruments. First of all, one of the things about medical instruments, it was only after Lister and the bacteriology was understood in the 1870s, 80s, that surgical instruments took on their Scandinavian modern look. Before that, they'd be pretty, they'd be knurled, they'd have carving in them. They were really beautiful in that sense. It's a different beauty. But all these little places for dirt to accumulate, bacteria to accumulate, they didn't realize that that was where, that was a source of infection. So everything was nice, pretty instruments. And just to give you, this is an amputation saw, and I have one up here. The idea was to do the amputation. First of all, what about anesthesia? Anesthesia came in the 1840s, chloroform, and to a lesser extent, ether. So that was a help for the Civil War, but it wasn't always available. And the best surgeons were fast. You don't want to be a half-fast surgeon, I suppose, or anything else. But the idea was to do something like, take one of these amputation knives, and if it was a leg, to do some tricky maneuver that you can make one swell foop. Just sort of bring it around with one quick motion. Especially this is really if anesthesia isn't effective. I mean, if it's effective anesthesia, that doesn't really matter. So you take your amputation knife, and then you take your saw, and these saws are perfectly good miter saws for your carpenters, and you'd cut the leg off and then suture it up. This is another type of saw that was used. This is like a little chainsaw. Pardon? Right, and they're used in particular. Still using it, and I think they're sometimes used in brain surgery too. With you put two burr holes, and that's what this next. I'll talk about that, and then you put this through, and you just pull it back and forth, and it's a nice little little chainsaw. So many of the instruments that were used then, except the knurling and everything, very similar. I mean, they now I guess there's some more mechanical and some electric machines that work, but very, very similar. So there's your amputation saw. There's a Hayes saw for cutting skull fragments. I have one over here. This is a bullet extractor, artery forceps, tourniquet. Everybody was bleeding from everywhere, and that was really important. Trocars, and trocars, I have a couple of trocars here, but they were used just about everything. Everybody would get some pus or fluid accumulating someplace. They didn't have, again, no antibiotics, no other ways. And what they would do is just stick this wherever it needed to be stuck, then pull this out, and you have a tube, a hollow silver tube. And we use this in, sort of modification. We use chest tubes, but instead of this, we put a hole in the chest, and then very carefully, because you don't want air to get in there, you slip a plastic tube in, tie it tightly, and that goes to other tubing so you can expand the lung, get the fluid out, and not have the lung collapse. Well, they didn't have all these niceties. They were just trying to get pus out, or bladder that's distended, and they couldn't get a catheter in. They just stick it down here and let urine drain out. Or any place else that had an accumulation of pus, or any. These are all variations of trocars. So that's one example of a surgical kit. Those are two. There's a trephine. Let me see if I think I have one more. That's just another saw, amputation saw, variation on the same theme. The amputation knives. W.W. Kahn famous surgeon in the mid to late 19th century, said, this is years after the war, said, quote, "We operated in old blood-stained and often pus-stained coats with undisinfected hands. We used undisinfected instruments and marine sponges which had been used in prior pus cases and only washed with tap water," end quote. So in other words, if somebody was having some sort of surgery and the person before was picked up and pus draining out, sponge would be used. You'd rinse it off in a little tap water and use it on the next case. And if that case wasn't infected, it certainly will be after the pussy sponge. It must be very difficult to clean out the inside of a sponge, I should think. Trephining. And I didn't have a slide of that, but I brought a trephine. This is a trephine. This has been used since ancient times, not this instrument. This is probably early to mid 19th century. But people had, if you get a head injury, as I'm sure most of you know, the skull is a closed space, and the brain is not very squinchable. So if you have an injury, and blood accumulates in there, the pressure builds up and squinches the brain, and it squinches it in certain places, and people lose consciousness. They may have seizures, lose consciousness, and die. And from ancient times, they knew they used to use flint. They used to use flint, to just chip away, and they found what do you call them? It's mummies and ancient skeletons that show these burr holes done primitive times, and some of them lived. And what is it called? Now I can't think of the word. Not anthropology. Not archaeology. What do you call it? Anyway, experts in that can tell, looking at the skull, to see whether the bones rounded off, whether that healed. I mean, if I had a head injury or whatever, and somebody did burr holes right now, and I died 20 minutes from now, those edges would be sharp, and you'd be able to look at that and say, there's somebody that had a hole in the head and died quickly. But in some of these, they found that it smoothed off, they healed, and they died at least a period after that. So this was certainly done during the Civil War, and that terrible description I gave before about, the men just lined up head injuries. There's 20 head injuries right along there, twitching, seizing. There were no seizure medicines, so you have this blood, on the brain causing them to seize. They're in coma. Probably most of them are in coma. And these are the situations where a trephine might help. And the way it's done, you open the skull, you cut the scalp, open it up, and then you take one of these gadgets, which has a little point on the end, and you start drilling through the head, through the skull, and then you move the point back so that point doesn't stick through too much. And the idea is to cut through the skull, through the two tables, the two thick, hard parts of the skull, and get inside and release the blood, ideally without putting a hole in the brain. You lose points for putting a hole in the brain. Well, I mean, that's the idea of it. And if it's successful, you can save a person's life. But then, I just don't know. I mean, I don't have any idea what the percentage was. But normally, I mean, you worry like hell about somebody getting meningitis. They're covered with antibiotics now. And just imagine this trephine that was in 3 other heads within the past hour or two being put in your head. We worry, AIDS and things like that. I mean, that's a problem, obviously. But I mean, just imagine the sort of thing that was going on there. So this is a trephine, and there's several instruments here. I didn't bring the whole case that are used for trephining. Arresting hemorrhage. Next are the treatment of gunshot wounds. And I think I have a slide. These are some instruments that are used in treating gunshot wounds. And this is one right here. And here's a ball. And what you would do, you have the hole through which the missile passed, and you put either one of these, or you might put one of these locators through, and just sort of what you're trying to feel for is is something hard, something metal, tap, that shouldn't be there. If it's soft tissue, muscle, fat, that's pretty easy. If there's bone all around, it gets a little tricky, because how do you tell a bone from a ball? And so that's often they would get the ball out if they could, the shot out if they could, but frequently they couldn't. And those are several instruments. And this is a book that I have. I have it up here, A Sergeant's Minor Surgery. And this is a book that a surgeon might use in the Civil War. There's a whole number of them, but this is in fact this is U.S. Army Hospital. In fact, this one, H.C. Levenseller, 19th Maine Volunteers. And that's the title page, Bandaging Operations Minor Surgery, 1862. And here's talking about gunshot wounds. In fact, I mentioned Baron Percy. This is 1862. Baron Percy with his one of his Percy's Wurst. Same Baron Percy. But here's several examples of bullet extractors. So that was a problem, getting out bullets and caring for gunshot wounds. Arresting hemorrhage was a big problem, and I have one there, but you saw before those tourniquets, and you had to use tourniquets everywhere. I mean, no blood, no transfusions, no fluid replacement, and of course, in the 1860s, bloodletting was still sort of in vogue, but it wasn't used much in the Army, from what I can gather. I mean, it was sort of it was done without the help of physicians, and then the relief of pain. As I mentioned, opiates, morphine was used by injection, but not too much, because morphine had just come in. And the injections, syringes were really discovered, I think it's 1854, by Alexander Wood, an Edinburgh physician, who is reading about his first use of the injection of morphine. Let me just tell you that what they used to use is they'd have morphine solution, and they'd sometimes make it into a paste, and then make a little hole in the skin and stick the paste of morphine through that. That's one way of getting morphine in. Another way was dipping a thread into the morphine and just running the thread through the skin, and some would be absorbed. Anyway, Alexander Wood got an instrument maker to make one of these little things called a syringe, and he went to see a little old lady who had brachial neuralgia. It sounds like bursitis to me by his description of it, but anyway. And she was having quite a bit of pain, and he gave her, I think it was the equivalent of either 20 or 30 milligrams of morphine in an injection, and that's quite a wallop for anybody. Anyway, he visited her the next morning and found her difficult to rouse. He was a little bit upset, but she roused later, and he gave her a rousing cheer, I guess. Anyway, and she did well, and that was the beginning of injections of morphine. And they used to think that morphine should be injected locally. They thought, if you had a sore shoulder, you should inject the morphine into the shoulder. They didn't realize it was a systemic, it was absorbed systemically. Anyway, so that's morphine, which is fairly new. I'd just like to end with, this is a local person. George Noyes was from Maine, and he was a hospital steward. He went to the Civil War and then got dysentery and came back, and then went to Bowdoin. Let me just go back. Here's his first book, first course, 1863, at the Bowdoin Medical School. That's I'm sure you all know Bowdoin had a medical school from 1820 until it was 1921. And there's his first course. And this is a little calligraphy. Marius is here. Angel of death, submit thou, hard to submit. This is while he was listening. Life is pleasant. Something neat. Anyway, that's his calligraphy on the, or his. And this is his book, Extracts of Lectures at his medical school. Anyway, so he went to the first course in 1863, and he, at the time, medical school consisted of 2 courses that were identical. Basically, at that time, it would have been anatomy and surgery, theory and practice of physics, materia medica, and I don't know if it's, no, it wouldn't be midwifery, it would be chemistry. I think that was it. And you'd have 2 courses that were identical. It wouldn't be chemistry 101, 102. It would be chemistry 101 and chemistry 101, and it would be identical. And once you took your 2 courses, generally never having touched a patient, you would go to lectures, you read your books, and you wouldn't touch your first patient until after you finished medical school. You should also serve an apprenticeship with a physician, which could be a good experience. In fact, now I was just at a meeting in Arizona, American College of Physicians, and you're talking about apprenticeship again, about getting medical students sort of out of the meccas into more rural areas to let them know what it's like to be a doctor, because what's happening, the people they're seeing at in the major cities, the physicians that are role models for them are all subspecialists. So nobody really, one takes care of the nostril, one takes care of the ear, one takes care of the heart and doesn't know that there's a liver. And I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not too much. So we may end up, cycles in history. We may end up going back to some extent to apprenticeships, and it's usually mutually beneficial. When I have medical students up with me, I mean, we're together. And the patient, it's the 2 of us, and they're treated differently. It's not, and for the patient, I think it's better. In big centers, frequently there's 4 medical students, 5 residents, 2 interns, residents now, attendings, and patient doesn't know what's happening. The medical student, who's low man or woman on the totem pole, if they're sensitive at all, feel kind of uncomfortable seeing somebody who's uncomfortable and asked to do a physical on them again. They may add something to it, but it's it's not very good. Anyway, that's definite aside. So apprenticeship. So here he goes back to between his 2 sessions, he goes back home, works as a teacher for a while, goes back to the next session, and his commanding officer snags him in Augusta and gets him to come back as a hospital steward. So he goes back to the Civil War, and here's his next book. Here's his course in 1866, and I don't think I have the inside. I don't know if that, no. And look what this is: U.S. Army Medical Department Register and Prescription Book. This is the book. This is the book he he must have gotten several of them when he left the Army. These blank books, he took them with him, and this is what he used for his notes at his second course at Bowdoin in 1866. And finally, I think this is the last slide. This makes me feel very artistic. This is a Civil War food warmer. And it just sort of gets back to the, we're talking about gunshots and everything. These are people suffering, hungry, cold, and there were some, few little niceties that, might help them feel more comfortable. And that's a Civil War food warmer. And I think that's about it. Can you turn on the lights? Would you turn on the lights, please? I think I've shown you most of the instruments that I have up here. I just brought a few. This is for bloodletting. This is a leach container. But they didn't use that during the Civil War. I just used this to carry my bullet and my ball in here. But that's what that is. And trocar, a urinary catheter. And I think that's about it. And I'd like to know if there's if there's any questions, or I'm sure a lot of you know, certainly you know a lot more about the Civil War than I do. I'm not a Civil War buff. I'm interested in history of medicine, and I'm interested in the Civil War, at least the medical aspects. I just think of some, what's happened. I think back to the 1870s and 80s, all sorts of things were happening. Bacteria were discovered, and all this thing was happening. But same thing's happening now. I mean, just think of all the instruments. Organisms are unfortunately, AIDS and many illnesses that we didn't have names, we didn't have organisms, we didn't have etiologic agents over the past 10 years or so. At least 15 or 20 have found the organism has been discovered. So, it continues. Etiologies for old diseases and unfortunately some new diseases to be conquered. I'd appreciate any questions. Marius?
Doctor, I'm not asking you like a judge, but are you surprised that the medical care was so good or so bad?
I guess I'm not really surprised either way. I think the conditions were just horrible. They were plunged into something they didn't have any experience with. I mean, it's really, they weren't set up for it at all. There were no field hospitals all ready to go. Okay, now here's a plan of operation. Just step in there. Medicine, they didn't do too well in private practice. With these same kinds of injuries. I think one of the problems, there had to be great haste. They would have all people together, and one of the problems, for example, with let me just turn this thing on. Okay, if you turn it off in a minute. Hospitalism. People when people were brought together with injuries, they'd infect each other for the reasons I mentioned before. And for example, in Britain in the 1880s, 90s, there were studies showing that mortality from amputations, this was in peacetime, were directly proportional to the number of beds in the hospital. Well, it's more complicated than that. I mean, the big city hospitals were, big municipal city hospitals were taking care of indigent people, poor nutrition, and they would tend to be of, weaker constitution, more likely to get infected, and for all sorts of other reasons. And the lowest mortality was in cottage hospitals of less than 25 beds. So here, in situations like this, where they're putting all people together in one of these Harwood hospitals, these big hospitals lined up, okay, it's amputation time, everybody has their leg off, this. Well, let me just give you another example, and this is in the 1890s, and peacetime, Bellevue Hospital tried to, in 1890, this is after Lister and after Koch and all that, they tried to make an edict saying that no physician, no passerby should put his finger in the wound. In other words, if I was doing a surgical procedure and you came by, another physician, and said, "What are you doing, Richie?" And I said, "Oh, I'm doing this this surgery." He said, "Let me see." And remember, no gloves. Put his finger in. Hey, that's interesting, and then walk on. Maybe wipe his finger off so he didn't. But that and what was said, scarcely any of the physicians would allow this intrusion on their rights. I mean, it was just something that was done. And just to give you some other idea, the surgeons would keep suture material in their pocket and run it through the buttonhole. So you'd be there'd be suture material coming through the buttonhole, cut off that much. So and that's the way they did it. Gloves didn't come in until the 1890s, and that's a little love story. Halsted, the great surgeon at Johns Hopkins, had a scrub nurse who was really great, and she was really terrific, but she developed an allergy to the phenol, to carbolic acid, and she would have to leave surgery, or unless he could do something. So he asked Goodyear or Goodrich, the blimp or the non-blimp company, I can never keep it straight, if they could make some gloves that would protect her hands from the phenol and allow her to feel the instruments. And the time was right. People have thought about this before, but the time was right, and the technology was available, and they made the gloves, and she stayed. In fact, he subsequently married her. That was Mrs. Halsted. I don't think she was a cocaine addict also. That I know. He was, but I don't think she was. Anyway, and so in the 1890s, Halsted did a study of uncomplicated appendicitis and herniorrhaphies, hernias, inguinal hernias, and to see if it had decreased the infection rate, and it did, and that's how gloves came in. But even in the early 20th century, there were hospital administrators bitching that, why are we getting all these gloves? We used to do just fine without these gloves. These big expenses are costs are going up because of these damn gloves. Anyway, things like that. It takes a while for everything to catch on, for many things to catch on. Some things it takes a while to catch on and maybe takes too long, but then the other side of that is wrong also, or bad, where things are picked up so fast before they're really studied well. And that's a problem, I think, nowadays. And part of one of the things that happens, it gets put in the lay press, which, I'm glad everybody knows about everything, but what that ends up is driving medicine. It ends up causing medicine to do things that they really don't think, I don't think the evidence is really good that this is useful. And the patients come in and say, well, I read it in New York Times, or I read it here, Time Magazine, whatever, and so it can affect the physician's judgment and treatment. And I think that's bad, because much of that newscasting, whatever you want to call it, is basically advertising for the drug companies and various people. And so you end up having the drug companies say, this is great stuff, use this for cholesterol, and everybody says, hey, I want my cholesterol medicine, and it gets used, and then find out a year or 5 years later that it's really not very, it's not so terrific. Yes?
The Europeans,
I'm sorry.
any advanced,
No, it's okay. Why don't you go ahead?
Any advanced in comparison with here in this country at that time?
Not that I could see. I mean, part of it, I guess, it depends on which wars. And the Crimean sounds like it was hideous. You read Florence Nightingale, or you read things about the war there. That was absolutely the pits. And I don't think Civil War was any better. And part of it may have to do with where it is. I mean, the dysentery, the diarrhea, all this business probably would not have been, my guess is, wouldn't have been as much of a problem if the war had been fought in Illinois, Maine, Massachusetts, because not as the swamps, the heat, some of the malaria certainly wasn't a problem up here, yellow fever. So it may have been, some of the illnesses may have been different. I think you had a question back there. Well, think back of the, some of the Jewish, customs and meats, foods, and all that business. But I really don't know that in warfare, whether it affected winning and losing battles. That certain armies, that they really did and could affect those good sanitation activities. I don't think I really know the answer to that. It seems logical as far as food, but remember, they didn't understand the cause of these things. They didn't understand that. For example, even take Maine General Hospital when it opened in 1874. The reason it was built that way is they thought that disease was spread from one ward to another by air. And that's, most of you probably know Maine General Hospital, but the old building, and where there's a central sort of higher part, and then the two wings. And when you walk, especially in the winter, between one wing and the center, you freeze because it's all windows. And the idea of that was that if an epidemic broke out in one wing, it would come to the center area with all the windows and spin out and go out. Since it was on Bramhall's Hill, it would go out and it wouldn't get to the next wing, because that's how they thought it was spread. And then they'd go like this with the next patient, and for a long time they wore black aprons so they wouldn't show all the dirt and everything. And they just, it sounds crazy to us, but they didn't have any understanding of it. And you can go back to Semmelweis with the purple sepsis in the 1840s. You know about all that, don't you? About deliveries. Do you know about that? This is really I think we should get off obstetrics if we're talking about the Civil War. It wasn't a big problem. I didn't even see it on that list. Well, maybe the camp followers. Yes.
Out of every war,